Hi, thanks for joining me again today. I'm going to be talking more about the Fourth Amendment, but we're switching gears a little bit. So last time I was talking about generally what was or was not covered and protected under the Fourth Amendment. What was a search, what was not a search, and we had our two tests that we were using when we were looking at each of those situations. So I think we've covered that as well as I can in these videos. Now I'm going to be talking about situations where the government is intruding into these constitutionally protected areas, but perhaps the Supreme Court has ruled that it's okay under certain circumstances or not okay under other circumstances, and why. So the first kind of way that the government is intruding into people's lives would be, well, what about police stops? What about when a police officer stops somebody out on the street? Because it's something that happens all the time, and certainly that would be an intrusion of the police officer on the person. So when a police officer stops somebody and they do what we call a detention, what they need is reasonable suspicion. Reasonable suspicion exists when a police officer has specific and articulable facts to believe that a crime is being committed or criminal activity is afoot. So in a situation where a police officer has reasonable suspicion to believe that there's criminal activity afoot, they can stop somebody and do an investigation, ask them questions, things like that. A reasonable suspicion is used in a couple different situations. So, for example, if the police officer stops somebody, in some situations they'll do what's called a stop and frisk. Now that's when a police officer pats the person down, trying to see if there are weapons or something like that on the person that might affect the police officer's safety. And that's commonly known as a Terry stop in the legal field. And there's a reason that in the legal profession we call this a Terry stop rather than calling it a stop and frisk all the time, although both are really interchangeable. So the reason for that is because the terminology and the issue was really raised in front of the Supreme Court in a case called Terry versus Ohio. And that was a situation where a police officer had specific and articulable facts to believe that a crime was being committed, and the officer pat down the person who they had suspected of the crime for weapons. And what the court was looking at was whether or not the officer had a reasonable belief that the person was armed and dangerous. So that's another part of reasonable suspicion, right? If a police officer has reasonable suspicion to believe that you're armed and dangerous, then they can pat you down. But what's important and very nuanced under the Fourth Amendment is that pat down is limited to the outer layer of clothing. The officer cannot intrude within that outer layer. So if somebody's wearing a big coat, the officer has to pat down the outside of that coat. They can't reach inside that coat and pat you down within that outer layer. It seems like kind of an odd nuance, but it's an important one. And another important aspect of this too is if the officer feels a weapon or feels like drugs or some other thing that the person's holding illegally, the officer has to know based off of that touch. They can't feel something, wonder what it is, and then reach in and then figure out what was in the pocket. They need to know upon touching the outer layer of clothing, this is some kind of drug, or this is some kind of illegal object, or this is a weapon. I can feel the butt of a gun, I know that this is a weapon, or I felt the knife, I knew it was a knife. So that's a little introduction into reasonable suspicion. I'll talk a little bit more about it in the next video. I'm not sure how long we'll stay on this topic, but I think it's important to understand that even though there are these constitutionally protected areas, there are ways that police officers are still able to intrude into these areas. It's also important for people to know exactly what the standard is for police officers to invade into these areas. Otherwise, how are we going to hold police officers accountable when they actually lack reasonable suspicion or probable cause, which we'll talk about later. It's important for us to know our rights and the law as individual citizens as well. So thank you for joining me today. If you have any questions about this topic, I would recommend you consult an attorney. If you have a criminal case, obviously I would recommend you consult an attorney to talk about the issues of your case. Maybe there are some Fourth Amendment issues, and that's something that your attorney can discuss with you. Um, but thanks for joining me. I hope you'll join me next time. We're shifting gears a little bit here, but we're all still within the Fourth Amendment, and there's plenty more legal doctrine that we need to go through. Thank you.